Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Kathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakari Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We are so happy that you're here with us today and so excited to be speaking with Professor Christopher Burkett on Brutus II and Federalist 51, the separation of powers. And before we get started, we're going to introduce our panel. And I want to start with Aubrey Jackman, who's our media director. And while I introduce Aubrey is going to put up a poll that our audience can answer so we can find out a little bit about you and who's in our audience today. So we'd like you to just check off if you're a student, a teacher, a parent or grandparent with children, donor, press, family, friend. We have categories for everyone. So if you'll check that off. And I want to say a little bit about Aubrey. Aubrey is responsible for all of this fabulous technology. She's this year's We the Future Best College STEM winner. Aubrey's born and raised in Utah in the middle of 7 children. She's a student at Brigham Young University and aspires to be an athletic coach. So Aubrey, would you like to say hello?
Yes, thank you, Kathy. Really quick, I'm just going to put in a plug that if after this webinar, you want to share this with any of your friends or you missed any of it, we do record it and post it on our website. So that's just a handy little thing to know. But now I will share the poll results so we can all know who's with us today. So the largest group we have with us is 28% friends, and then we have 24% fans, and then 16% parents or grandparents with children, then a 12% donors, then we have 8% middle and high school students and 8% teachers, and then 4% families. So we are just so glad that all of you are here today.
Well, welcome everyone. And we want to thank our sponsor for today's episode, who makes all of this possible, Mr. George Waller. George is the co-owner of Valley Valve Supply in Bryan, Texas, along with his brother, John. Valley Valve Supply was started in 1965 by George's father, and George and John took over in 1991. George is a graduate of Texas Tech University, is married to Meredith Waller, and they have 3 outstanding young adult children, one of which Constituting America has had the pleasure of getting to know over the years, Caroline Waller, who has helped us with our winter mentor trips in Washington, D.C. So thank you, George. Thank you, Waller family, and thank you, Valley Valve Supply, for making today's Constitutional Chats episode possible. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce the rest of our panel. I'm going to start with our founder and co-president, the actress Janine Turner. Janine is famous for her role as Maggie O'Connell in television's Northern Exposure. She's the founder and co-president of Constituting America, which she launched in 2010. And Janine is still acting. As a matter of fact, just got back from filming a movie just about a week ago. And she is also actively teaching kids about the U.S. Constitution, having given over 540 speeches to classrooms across the country. Now, Janine may be on right now or may be joining us just a little bit later. Janine, are you on to say hello? And if not, we'll go on to Tova Kaplan and come back to Janine. Tova is a 17-year-old student from Chicago, Illinois. She's a 3-time winner of the We the Future contest and is the National Youth Director of Constituting America and runs our Youth Advisory Board. Tova is passionate about inspiring young people to know and use their constitutional rights. Tova, would you like to say hello?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you so much to our sponsors, and hope you're having a wonderful Tuesday.
Great. Thank you, Tova. Now, Jewel and Jorn, who are usually with us, cannot be with us today, but we have the fabulous Hensley brothers standing in for them, Wyatt and Jonah Hensley. And I'm going to introduce Jonah first. Jonah is age 18 and lives in Joplin, Missouri, and is attending Pittsburgh State University in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He'll be majoring in criminal justice with a double minor in military science and leadership studies, as well as a major in biology. Jonah received a 4-year Army ROTC scholarship, so he'll be active within his ROTC group and will eventually graduate out of college to become a second lieutenant within the United States Army. Jonah is an Eagle Scout and Missouri State degree recipient with the FFA. Jonah is a 2-time Constituting America We the Future contest winner and finds great interest in American history. Jonah, would you like to say hello?
Hello. Thank you for having me today.
We're so glad to have you. And we now have Wyatt Hensley. Wyatt is from Joplin, Missouri as well. He's 16 and a junior in high school. Wyatt is involved in many activities and organizations, including his school's student council, FFA, Boy Scouts of America, and more. Wyatt is proud of many accomplishments, such as earning his Eagle Scout, being elected junior class president of his school, and being also a 2-time winner of Constituting America's We the Future contest alongside his brother Jonah. Wyatt loves to travel around the country and is passionate about learning America's history, and he hopes to become a U.S. history teacher where he can teach our country's history and its importance to future students. So Wyatt, thank you so much for joining us. Would you like to say hello?
Yeah, I'm excited to be here and I'm very excited to learn.
Wonderful. And now we are very excited to introduce our very special guest, Professor Christopher Burkett. Christopher Burkett is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program at Ashland University, where he teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on American political thought, including the American founding, American foreign policy, and the progressive era. He's the editor of 50 Core American Documents, required reading for students, teachers, and citizens, and author of several articles and chapters. Professor Burkett is also the 2011 recipient of the Edward and Luanne Taylor Excellence in Teaching Award at Ashland University. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Ashland University and his MA and PhD in politics from the University of Dallas. Welcome, Professor Christopher Burkett. We are so happy to have you here, and we'd ask that if you could just start with some opening comments on separation of powers and Brutus II and Federalist 51.
I'd be happy to. And let me first say I'm honored to be on a panel with so many fine people with great, it seems like great and interesting minds, and are so ambitious and doing great things with themselves. And I'm especially delighted that we're going to have this conversation drawing from original documents, Brutus II and Federalist number 51. I think using original documents is a great way to not only bypass some of the bias that you might find in textbooks and other things, but it's almost as though we're also having a conversation with Brutus and Publius. So I've been really looking forward to this. So very impressive, and I'm especially happy that we're talking about this topic, which was a very, very important issue for Anti-Federalists, especially during ratification of the Constitution. And we'll get in, I'm sure, as we get into our conversation, we'll get into some of the details of their concerns and why they thought this was so important. But I also want to just start by pointing out, in case people aren't aware of this, who were Brutus and Publius. Maybe we're aware already of who Publius was. Publius is the pseudonym for the 3 authors of the Federalist Papers. You may have heard of Alexander Hamilton. He now has a musical in his name, so he's pretty well known. And James Madison and John Jay, who wrote a handful of the papers before he fell ill and could no longer write much. Brutus, we're not quite sure who Brutus is. For a long time, scholars thought that he was Robert Yates of New York. Robert Yates had been a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and didn't like the direction things were going, and actually left about halfway through the convention and went back home to New York to start laying the groundwork for the Anti-Federalist resistance to ratification before they had even finished writing or drafting the Constitution. So Brutus may be Yates. He may also be a fellow named Melancton Smith. who was a businessman in New York, a very well-known local politician, highly respected. And more, I think people are considering him as a possible author of the Brutus letters, in part by comparing some of the arguments that he makes in the Brutus letters to the arguments that Melanchthon Smith himself made at the New York State Ratifying Convention. So, and I just want to point out that I think it's interesting that we are focusing on two documents that are written to New Yorkers primarily, right? Not just to people of New York, but Brutus is a New York Anti-Federalist. And New York is a very important state when it comes to ratification. As you know, having studied the Constitution, 9 out of 13 states have to ratify for this Constitution to go into effect. By the time we get to New York, 8 states have ratified, and we need one more. And the question in 1788 is, who is it going to be? Which state will it be? New York, Virginia, New Hampshire? We know it's not going to be Rhode Island or North Carolina. They're pretty much out. They've said no. So it kind of comes down to New York. So some of the best arguments, I think, and really come out of the New York Anti-Federalists, and especially Brutus, who's very articulate, very passionate about what he's writing and his concerns about the Constitution. And so I think it's really a great thing that we're looking at a very important document from the Federalist Papers, number 51, written by James Madison, who is not of New York. He's of Virginia, of course, right? But he is in New York writing to help out with this project. And then on the other hand, Brutus, a New York Anti-Federalist. So the argument of Brutus, in a nutshell, is, let me do it this way, if you don't mind. The Anti-Federalists in all of the states have various concerns about the way powers are separated. But it's interesting, depending on the state you're in, the Anti-Federalists who are writing tend to ground their concerns on what they know in their own state. Each state is kind of different on the state level in terms of how they've separated powers. And so Brutus is writing based on what he knows about separation of powers in the state of New York. And there's a tradition that says when you separate powers, and we're talking about separating legislative powers and executive powers and judicial powers, the tradition is you want to separate them strictly, right? So all legislative power goes into this set of hands, all executive goes into the executive, all judicial power goes here. And Brutus also, though, believes that the best way to keep powers separated, once they're separated, is to have a Bill of Rights. On the other hand, James Madison, writing as Publius, is going to argue that it's more about how you separate the powers. That is, you don't simply want to say all legislative power here, all executive power here, and all judicial power here. Madison actually makes a kind of counterintuitive argument that seems a little crazy to Brutus and other Anti-Federalists, in which he says, you want to blend those powers. You want to give some legislative power to this branch and to this branch and this branch and some executive power. And so it looks a little messy. It looks a little scary. It's very new. It's a very new understanding of separation of powers. And this leads to a great conversation and argument between between Brutus and Publius on this question. So I hope that gives us enough to sort of bite on and chew over a little bit to start with here. So
that was great. And before we jump to Janine, I just want to remind the audience that if you go on our website and click on Learn More on today's episode, you can find links to both Federalist 51 and Brutus II in case you haven't read it and you want to scan it real fast and be thinking of some questions for later in the program. So I want to jump to Janine. Janine, there you are.
Hi, everybody. I'm here. Oh, let's see. I'm going to switch my screen. There we go. Hello, everyone. Fabulous, wonderful panel. And our terrific guest, University of Dallas. I'm from Dallas. Well, I'm from Fort Worth, technically. If
yeah,
you're from
I was in Irving.
What's that?
The University of Dallas is in Irving, so.
Yeah, you're in between. You're in between. For those of you that don't know, there's always a rivalry between Dallas and Fort Worth. But yes, I drove by that University of Dallas in Irving all the time. Right. living in Fort Worth and working in Dallas, even as a youngster when I was 3 years old. But anyway, wonderful opening, very intriguing. I love the way you laid it out, and I love the way you think. Can you just go into it a little bit more about the differences on this subject between Madison and Brutus? Interesting too that they're both New Yorkers, but and how it relates to today. In other words, one of the things that I always do, we all have our points that we like to cover, but is how does it compare to our checks and balances today? Who was right? I know that the Anti-Federalists were very interested in the Bill of Rights, and they were really worried about too much power being given to anyone. When this was happening, had the compromise happened yet? Where were they with? It's hard to remember exactly how this was, but I know that Madison, I think, wanted just one house, just the house, I believe, and then somebody else, and they went back and forth, and they hadn't reached. There was the different type of compromises, but the great compromise, which one of our founding fathers that we discussed on the show helped author. Who was it, everybody? Does anybody remember? Tova, do you remember? I know someone's gonna look it up. What, I don't remember either, but one of them was one of the, we had a founding fathers segment. One of them was responsible for the Great Compromise. Was it the physician?
Was it Roger Sherman?
Yeah. Okay. Very good, Kathy. Woo! He wins the award for the day. Okay. So had the Great Compromise by Roger Sherman. Had that happened yet in this process? Where were we in the process here of building this United States Constitution?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So they had just wrapped up the Constitution shortly before, of course, in September, right? September 17th, they wrapped up the work at the convention. Yes, it was Roger Sherman who sort of, negotiated this compromise, the Great Compromise, as you rightly put it. And there's an interesting story about James Madison, who was the author here writing his Publius of Federalist 51, who didn't necessarily like that compromise. And the compromise was, as you pointed out, Janine, Madison wanted both houses. If we're going to have two houses, he wanted both houses to have what he called proportional representation. That is, the number of representatives you send to each house should be based on the number of people that live in each state. So New York has more people, they should send more representatives. Virginia has more, they should send more. And Roger Sherman's Connecticut Compromise had said, okay, how about we do proportional representation in what they called the first house, what we now call the House of Representatives. But the states ought to be equally represented because the states are really important, Sherman argued, right? So the states ought to be equally represented in at least one house. And the convention had agreed on that. And James Madison was not he voted against it, actually, at the convention. So now here's why I think this is a great question, though, because when it comes to separation of powers, although Madison was not in favor of having the states equally represented in the Senate, Madison is this guy, and I've spent a lot of time studying Madison. He to me is maybe the most fascinating of all the founders, because he's the sort of person who will take lemons and make lemonade out of it. So, okay, we have equal representation in the Senate. Not a big fan, but Madison says the good thing about that is it gives us an opportunity to make the Senate really different from the House in its nature and what it does and who they are and how they think of themselves. And maybe the Senate can serve as a check on the House and maybe vice versa. So it's the fact that the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise happened that really gives Madison, writing his Publius here, something to stand on, to say that it's good that these two houses are different in the end because they can check each other. And of course, that becomes a vitally important way to keep those powers separated. Once they're separated by the Constitution, the big problem is how do you keep them separated? And this is, I think, connected to the first part of your question, Janine. How is this relevant today? Well, what Madison, Publius, and Brutus both have in common, and I think are both right on, is that human beings are, look, as long as human beings are human beings, there is always a tendency for them to want to once in power, to get more power, right? And to get more power, they have to take it away from others. And if you have that tendency, right, for people who are elected, who may be otherwise good people, but they want more power to do good things or bad things, depending on who it is. The trick is, how do you keep them? How do you stop them from doing it? And the answer for Brutus is two things. One, compartmentalize, if you will, power. So all legislative power goes here, all executive power goes here, all judicial here, but also have a Bill of Rights that we can hold up and say, look, the Congress is doing this and they shouldn't do that. It says right in the Bill of Rights. But for James Madison, his argument in Federalist 51 is, human nature being what it is, people will always find ways, right, to get around things and find ways to accumulate power. So you've got to build in mechanisms, or if you want, that's kind of a technical term, but you've got to build these things into your Constitution that will allow others to stand up and try to stop them from accumulating power or taking powers away from others. And I think that's an ongoing, that's always going to be an issue, so long as James Madison puts it in Federalist 51, so long as human beings govern human beings. So I hope that helps a little bit.
It does. Men are not angels. That's what Madison
That's right.
said. Mm-hmm. And was it in Federalist 51 when he said that?
Yes. Yeah. Maybe one of the memorable lines from the whole piece.
It's really, 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 really powerful. I guess I knew that they wrote Publius after at the Federalist, after all the opinion editorials after they finished the Constitution. I guess what threw me was that Brutus, quote unquote, left early, you said, I think, to go back to New York. And so I was thinking, I wonder what he'd heard and where they were in the process. Because we talked about last week that there was someone else at the convention that didn't hear all the arguments and how they left early as well. I don't remember who, but they didn't hear all the arguments. And it was really, I think, pivotal to be there and hear the debate. And I often say that what I believe we've lost in our Congress is the ability to have live debates on the floor. I know they do it occasionally, but I mean, to have everybody show up to now they have the TV screens and C-SPAN in their offices. And so they just sort of wait around, and just like we have lost the ability to communicate with social media, Congress has lost the ability to actually have debates and fiery debates. And thus, if you've lost the ability to have a fiery debate amongst one another, not grandstanding in front of a microphone in front of CNN or Fox, if you've lost the genuine ability to have a debate with one another and really reason, we're in trouble in our country. And then it bleeds into everything else, because they're not even setting an example of how we as Americans, even on the internet, should be having a nice debate with one another. A civic conversation, shall I say, which is one of our programs. Okay, I'm kind of rambling. I think there was a question I had somewhere, but I don't remember it. I'm just having one of those days.
When it comes to you, just jump in.
Okay.
I'm sorry, by the way, if I misunderstood your question, I apologize. No,
you didn't misunderstand my question. My question was, but then after you said that, I'm like, oh, duh, I knew they'd actually finished it, but go ahead.
I think I'm glad you clarified, because the person we thought was Brutus, and may still be Brutus, we're just not quite sure. There's no sort of smoking gun, letter that says I was Brutus. Yeah, Robert Yates, they thought he left the convention just before the compromise you were talking about, because he didn't he did not like, but he didn't want two houses. He wanted, one house and all this stuff. And he thought they were going too far. So he just went home to New York. And the other person may have been, yeah. And I know you've spoken with my friend Gordon Lloyd, who I've had the great honor of teaching with for about 14, 15 years every summer. And I don't want to go too far with this, but it's not much of a stretch to say almost everything I know about the Anti-Federalists I learned from Gordon. So, but Gordon may have pointed out that Alexander Hamilton, also from New York, actually left the convention. He got bored right after Yates left. Hamilton left and wrote a letter to George Washington saying, "Hey, when you guys get to something interesting, write me. I may come back." So Hamilton, who's also an author of almost half of the Federalist Papers, was missing for about a third of the convention as well. So,
wow, now there's a
Hamilton,
tidbit. I
yeah.
didn't know that. Oh my goodness,
And
Hamilton.
Hamilton, yeah.
Who was there? Who was there the entire time? George Washington.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
He
and
didn't
James
leave.
Madison. Yeah,
And James Madison. That's right. That's right. Okay. Tova, go ahead. Your turn.
Great, thank you. This is all really fascinating. I'm learning so much. And so I was wondering, with all this confusion about who might have been Brutus, why did the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists choose to keep their identities anonymous and often not even revealing it at all throughout their whole lives?
that's a great question, Tova. Thanks for asking that. We know that Publius. We don't know this for what the motive of every Anti-Federalist was, but we know that Publius wrote anonymously to avoid what they called the influence of name. So John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, these men were really well known throughout the 13 states at the time. They were well-known politicians. They had all been in the Confederation Congress, and people knew their names. And to avoid the idea that people would simply ratify the Constitution because they like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, they wrote under a pseudonym, and that allowed them, writing as Publius in the Federalist Papers, to put forward argument. Now they had to pretend that they weren't there at the convention, right? Which is sometimes tricky. They had to pretend like they weren't there, even though they were. So they would write things like, somebody at the convention must have made this argument, or this must have been what the delegates at the convention were thinking. But this allowed them to actually make arguments that the American people could hear, could think about, and then they could freely decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to ratify the Constitution or not. And I've mentioned this in my classes several times, and occasionally somebody says, well, yeah, but not a lot of Americans could read at the time. And I like to point out that, first of all, there were actually probably more Americans who could read at the time than we think there were. And certainly there were more, there was a higher literacy rate in the United States than in Europe. But the other thing to keep in mind is these were written as newspaper essays. And people would hang newspapers like in New York City, they'd hang these papers on street corner posts or the posts outside of taverns, and somebody who could read would come along and read them out loud, and large groups of people would listen. And they could hear and they could think about these things. So the motive of Publius was to allow the American people to freely debate for themselves without simply saying, well, Hamilton likes it, I guess I gotta like it, right? And I think that's also true of several Anti-Federalists, including Brutus. So I think that's a really wonderful question. And I don't think it was because they were afraid of repercussions, as I've read some people write. They were afraid that if they lost, that it might reflect badly on their names. I don't see any evidence in the historical documents to suggest that. I really think their motives were higher than that. That is, that they really believe that this is a free country made up of free citizens who really must choose for themselves. As Alexander Hamilton put it in Federalist I, they must reflect and choose on whether or not they think this will lead to good government. Anything else, being forced upon them it's sort of tyrannical, right? Or too despotic in a way. So.
Right. I think that's really interesting. I think too often today, people rely on, do the opposite. They rely on their name or on their celebrity to put forward their opinions when it kind of should be the opposite. Your opinion should be good enough that it shouldn't matter who you are. But I digress. So can you talk more about the audience of these papers? As you mentioned, it was more widely read, but did the public opinion really influence the outcome of the debate, or was it more based on what the representatives' own conscience told them?
Yeah, that's another fantastic question. I do think that the Federalist Papers and the essays written by the Anti-Federalists did have a profound impact on the public's understanding of what this Constitution is and what it would be like and how it would work. Would it work? Would it not work? So it had an influence on the public mind, and it's important to note that, excuse me, every state, of course, with the exception of Rhode Island, they kicked the can down the road for 3 years. They didn't actually vote on ratification until 1791, I believe. But in all the other states, they have conventions to get together and debate and decide whether or not to ratify. Those delegates at those state ratifying conventions were popularly elected. They were elected by the people, and they sort of ran, as a delegate on whether they were a Federalist or an Anti-Federalist, whether they tended to be for the Constitution or against it. And so it's actually the people of each state who are selecting these delegates who are going to then go off to wherever in their state and debate and then decide whether or not to ratify. So this is why I think Madison and Hamilton and Jay initiated this project. Its primary purpose is to influence the public mind. So then they would go off and vote for people who would hopefully, be in favor of ratification at the state convention. So it was immediately written to the people of New York. If you read the Federalist Papers, right? And Brutus is also writing specifically, he says, to the people of New York, because they're the ones who have to vote on who the delegates are going to be. So just a quick point. I'm doing too much talking. I apologize, but maybe one or two quick points on that. If you gauge the effectiveness of their arguments by who gets elected to the New York State ratifying convention, there are many, many more Anti-Federalists elected in New York to go to their convention than Federalists. Federalists are outnumbered. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it's something like 120 Federalists to 160 some Anti-Federalists. That does not look good for ratification, right? So clearly Brutus and other New York Anti-Federalists who are writing had an effect on the public mind. The other thing I wanted to point out quickly, though, was the Federalists who were writing the Federalist Papers, right? Publius writing the Federalist Papers. They addressed them to the citizens of New York, but they also, I think, were writing with an eye to influence elections on ratification in other states as well. So the Anti-Federalists, like Brutus, tended to write simply to the people of their own state, whereas James Madison and Hamilton were trying to create an argument for the Constitution that could sort of be used in any state, right? So again, there were 5 states left in 1788 that had ratified. So they're also making their arguments in the hopes that they're going to influence the decision in New Hampshire, in Virginia, in North Carolina, and maybe eventually Rhode Island as well. So sorry for that long-winded answer. I hope that was what you were getting at, Tova. That was such a great question.
It definitely was. I love long-winded answers. That means you have a lot of good stuff to say. I could talk forever, but I'll pass it on to everyone else.
Oh, okay. Well, then I was waiting to interject that's why when you talk about Tova, once again, a wonderful question, who are they trying to influence but what's interesting to me is that yes, when you say there were more Anti-Federalists than Federalists, then I was thinking it's interesting that the Federalists won this argument when there were more Anti-Federalists than Federalists. But then I thought it was because of Washington. Washington wrote that letter. Washington gave the whole Constitutional Convention, which was a bit underhanded. He gave it the dignity, the purpose. Everyone, revered him, and he gave it the clout. And then also, when it was over, he wrote a letter to everyone saying, "I think this is the." And so it was really, I think, Washington. Of course, it was Publius, but Washington. What if they hadn't had Washington, which is why he really is the indispensable man? Would the Constitution really have passed? And if you make that answer 10 seconds, because I always hate interjecting when it's really Jonah and Wyatt's time. So 10-second response, and then I'll go to, and then Jonah, you're on.
Yeah, well, I agree. And here's what, 10 seconds. In the end, the Anti-Federalists come around in New York because they trust that the Federalists, which includes George Washington and James Madison, they trust that they will do the right thing and fix the Constitution once it's ratified. But that trust, you got to trust George Washington, right? That trust brings them around. So I think you're spot on.
And the Bill of Rights. Okay, go ahead,
Yeah.
Jonah.
A lot of great information. Thank you for all that wonderful information. I learned a lot. I have one question in specific. We talk about the Bill of Rights a lot. Why do you think that, since it was a very vital issue for the Anti-Federalists, why do you think that the Federalists did not see the Bill of Rights to be really a big issue at all?
I love that question. And there were really two views of Federalists. There were two responses Federalists gave. And let's call them the Alexander Hamilton response. And then we'll do the James Madison response, right? Both Federalists. The Alexander Hamilton response is a Bill of Rights is dangerous. Because what if you don't list, a Bill of Rights, you have to list all your rights. What if you leave one out, or 10 out, or 20, right? And so Alexander Hamilton said bills of rights can actually be dangerous, because if you don't list everything, then the government is going to assume that you don't have that right. And Hamilton made that argument repeatedly, and including in the Federalist Papers. And that didn't make Anti-Federalists, they didn't buy it. That didn't make them feel any better about the question, right? So the James Madison version Federalist response to this great question is, he says, I don't think bills of rights are dangerous. I just think that they're not that useful. They're not that effective at preventing tyranny. Because a Bill of Rights, it lists your rights, but it's really just kind of James Madison called it a parchment barrier. It's a piece of paper. And what James Madison had seen, by the way, throughout the 1780s, is that all the state governments had bills of rights. But those state governments were violating those rights left and right, including in Virginia, Madison's own Virginia. He saw his own legislature passing laws that violated the rights that were listed in their Declaration of Rights. So Madison famously said that a well-constructed Constitution is a better Bill of Rights than any listing of rights could ever be. If you separate powers properly, and you have the checks and balances that prevent one branch from doing things that it shouldn't do, or trying to take powers from other branches, that's a better security of your rights than any declaration or Bill of Rights could ever be. So for Madison, it's all about how you construct the government, right? How it works. And that means sometimes people are going to be butting heads and fighting each other over power, as he says in Federalist 51. But that's a more effective way than writing things down and trying to hold up a piece of paper. Because if somebody has the power, if government has the power and they want to do something, they can just ignore that, piece of paper. They shouldn't do it, but they might, right? So,
correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't one of Brutus's arguments were too that the national government, the federal government had more power over the states, in the sense of that their law was more, like, whenever it came to more national laws, was more supreme. So then those Bill of Rights in the states that I think was mentioned, would not work against like the federal government's one.
Exactly. Yeah, you're exactly right. The supremacy clause, right, in the Constitution.
Yes,
that says
yes,
this
yes.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And Brutus and others say, look, that supremacy clause means all the protections of rights, all the bills of rights in the various states the federal government can snap their fingers and make them irrelevant immediately. So I'm glad you shifted us toward, trying to get into the anti-federalist view of this. To the anti-federalists like Brutus, a Bill of Rights was absolutely essential, as he says in this Brutus #2, right? It is absolutely essential that every free people have a Bill of Rights. And his argument is it can actually be useful to stop abuses of power by government. Just having it at least is better than not having it, right? Because you can at least hold it up and say you shouldn't be doing these things. You shouldn't be violating these rights. But his other point is that having a Bill of Rights reminds the people that they are, in fact, a free people. They are free. It says you have a Bill of Rights. The fact that you have a Bill of Rights, it says we are free and we, the people, have rights. And that serves as a reminder of that fact and can do a lot to rally, resistance to unjust, unconstitutional acts by the government. So it's vitally important that we have a Bill of Rights, according to Brutus.
Okay, I'm gonna.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonah.
Great question.
I'm going to toss it to Wyatt, but I just want to interject as I do that that's why Antonin Scalia said really the Bill of Rights wasn't that original, and Kathy talks about this a lot too. It was really the checks and balances in the government that protected those rights. Our checks and balances is what was so incredibly original, because they kind of had the Magna Carta and all of this. They've kind of been around, but the way the way they miraculously kept tyranny at bay with those checks. Okay, go ahead.
Great.
Go ahead, Wyatt.
Thank you. This is all just very fascinating. As someone who loves U.S. history, I thought I know a lot of it, but every time I listen to a chat, I always listen and learn new information. So one of my questions is about Madison. So you said that he didn't think a Bill of Rights was necessary, but when we look back today, he's considered the father of the Bill of Rights. So what kind of changed that? Was it the Anti-Federalist Fuse or what?
Oh, again, this is such a great question. Yeah, so what Madison says, I do not think a Bill of Rights is necessary. This Constitution, the way it's written, will better secure your rights. So why does he introduce the amendments that go on to be the Bill of Rights, right? So after the Constitution is ratified and the new government goes into effect, Madison is elected to the House of Representatives. He's in the first Congress. I think to answer this, I want to backtrack a little bit and just tell a story which involves a possible author of the Brutus papers. I mentioned him earlier, Melancton Smith. Again, we're not sure if it's Yates or Smith or maybe a few others, but I like to think that it's Melancton Smith because of the story. Melancton Smith was a leader of a lot of the Anti-Federalists in New York, and he was at the New York State Ratifying Convention. And again, Anti-Federalists far outnumbered Federalists going into the debate. And they're debating and they're debating and debating. It's going on and on and on. And finally, Melancton Smith, outside of the convention, goes to Alexander Hamilton, who's also there, and says, look, Alex, just look, what we Anti-Federalists really want is a Bill of Rights. Just if we have a Bill of Rights, all these other problems seem less serious, right? All these other concerns. So he says to Hamilton, can I get a promise from you and James Madison that if New York ratifies and we don't get a Bill of Rights in the next 5 years, can New York get out of the Union? Can New York get out of the Constitution? And Hamilton says, that is a fascinating question. Let me get on the phone and I'm going to give Madison's friends called him Jemmy. I'm going to give Jemmy a call. Of course, they didn't have phones back then, but so he writes this great letter to Madison and tells him about this conversation with Melancton Smith. And Madison writes back and says, I'm paraphrasing. No, once you ratify, you're in. Excuse me. But Madison suggests that anti-federalists like Smith can sort of rest assured that he and Federalists will do what they can to introduce amendments to make them to have a Bill of Rights. So I didn't put that very well, but essentially, without explicitly promising it, Madison sort of suggests that if we just get New York to ratify, then we'll talk about a Bill of Rights. Madison will, bring up a Bill of Rights in the first Congress. So when Madison then is elected to the House, he is actually the one who introduces amendments, and he stands up and he gives a speech. And one of the reasons he gives for introducing these amendments is there are many, he says, respectable gentlemen who oppose the Constitution, but who love their country. If we would just give them these amendments, they would love this Constitution, they would love this country, and they would once again be of one heart and one mind and one soul, I'm paraphrasing, with their fellow Americans. So what Madison is saying is they're counting on us. They trusted us. And this goes back to Janine's question as well, this trust issue, right? They trusted us. So by the way, Melancton Smith, when he gets James Madison's response to Hamilton, Melancton Smith changes his mind and he gets enough Anti-Federalists to vote for ratification. This is how New York ends up ratifying the Constitution. It's because of this trust that Melancton Smith had in James Madison. So when Madison feels it's his obligation to stand up in Congress and introduce these amendments that go on to be our Bill of Rights, as a matter of honor, as a matter of faith, a good faith, to those Anti-Federalists. And it's a little disappointing for me to say this, but there was actually some opposition in Congress from Federalists to the Bill of Rights. So there were some who argued, we don't need to do this. We've won. Why are we bothering with a Bill of Rights? And Madison responds, because they trusted us. So, sorry, again, another long story, Wyatt, but that's the reason Madison gives for introducing the Bill of Rights.
Oh, no, that's just very fascinating. And if I can ask one more. So looking back now, who do you think would approve of our system currently now? Would it be more of the Anti-Federalists or the Federalists, or would they both be perfectly fine with how it's running now?
Love that question. That's a great question. I think they would both have concerns. I think I'll just come right out and say it. I think the Anti-Federalists especially would say, see, we told you, they would look at the tendency towards centralizing power on the national level, what the Anti-Federalists call, and Brutus calls consolidation of power, right, in the Brutus essay. They would say, see, this is exactly the sort of thing we've looked at. There's much more importance placed on what the national government does. The states seem to have decreased in importance. They've seen more and more power accumulate on the national level, maybe more and more power accumulating in the hands of the executive in the 20th century. So I'm pretty confident when I say that the Anti-Federalists would be most concerned today. But I do also think that James Madison and the Federalists would find some, would identify some important ways in which the power has shifted far beyond what the sort of balance, if you will, of power that Madison and the Federalists had hoped would be established between the states and the national government. I think even Madison would say that things have swung pretty far toward centralization of power in the national government. And even, I think Madison would also say, and this is where he and Hamilton would probably disagree, that the executive has taken on much more power. The president, right, has taken on a much more important role than he had envisioned in 1787, 1788. So
fascinating.
Great question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wyatt. All right, Kathy, you are on.
Well, Professor Burkett, Professor Gordon Lloyd is actually in our audience today.
Hey,
and
I'm honored.
He is affirming your thoughts on, do you pronounce it Melcanton Smith?
Melanchthon. Yeah.
Melanchthon Smith.
Yeah, Melancton.
Melanchthon Smith. So Professor Lloyd says, Chris and Janine, Brutus is reasonable all the way through his essays. Robert Yates was unreasonable at the convention and at the New York ratifying convention, and Melanchthon Smith was very reasonable throughout. So I think Brutus is more likely to be the reasonable Melanchthon Smith than an unreasonable Abraham Yates. So we did want to, and we just want to thank Professor Lloyd so much, who helped us design this study and has been our guest on several of our episodes and will be back, I'm sure, with us. Well, I know he will be for a few more episodes before we conclude. So thank you, Professor Lloyd. I had a question in Brutus II. The very last paragraph talks about treaties. And I guess the author, maybe Melanchthon Smith, is concerned that the United States power to make treaties, and he does note that the treaties have to be confirmed by 2/3 of the Senate, but he's concerned that the states, he's saying, have no power in the whole treaty process. And in knowing back then, it was before the 17th Amendment. So the states were at least appointing the senators. So in that way, there was some state check, I guess, on the treaties. But it doesn't look like that specific concern was necessarily addressed in the Bill of Rights. And could you talk a little bit about the concern of the states and the government's power to make treaties at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that Brutus is probably thinking more of commercial treaties, more so than, say, defensive treaties. But when it comes to commercial treaties, he says, let's see, all treaties made under the authority of the United States are the supreme law of the land and supersede the constitutions of all the states. The power to make treaties is vested in the president by and with the advice and consent of 2/3 of the Senate. I do not find any limitation or restriction to the exercise of this power. So what he's concerned with here is that the federal government, the national government, if you want to call them that, the president with the Senate is given sweeping power. There's no limit to the kind of commercial treaties that they can make. And I think the concern is, remember and I know you know this, Kathy, the states are very, very diverse in some ways in terms of what their economies are based on, right? So everything from, you have the commercial activities, farming, agriculture. The South, of course, has very different economies. I think what he's concerned with here may be that how can this Congress and this president of this whole country, this whole United States, find a way to make these treaties that will not sort of disproportionately benefit one state or some states and harm all the other states. So I think that may be a concern of his. And even though that may seem like a thing that he tacks on here at the end, for Brutus, this is just one more thing in a long list of things that this new government could do, right? That in the long run will not be good for the states, but be bad for the states. And it will defeat the very purposes for which we have a union and a constitution.
Well, thank you.
That's a great question.
We have another listener question that is geared a little bit towards modern day. Jeff R. says, considering the medical tyranny of the past year, do you think we should have an amendment to stop this, or does the 9th and 10th Amendment make this unconstitutional? There was another doctor in the constitutional delegation who warned about this very situation. And what do you recall? We did a constitutional chat on Dr. Benjamin Rush. Or maybe he signed the declaration, though. I don't even know if he was at the convention, but was there a doctor at the Constitutional Convention, do you recall, that warned?
Yes, yeah, there were a handful of doctors there, yeah. But this, of course, didn't, the idea that the national government should have the power to regulate health issues never came up, to my knowledge, at the convention. I think for most of them, they would have thought that this idea would have been far beyond the scope of what they had intended for the national government. That by the way, and this reminds us of the importance of the states. So the concern of a lot of anti-federalists was that this new national government, what we call the federal government today, was going to become so big and powerful and important that the states would no longer be relevant. But I think that a lot of people, including the Federalists like Madison and others, thought that the state governments do have an important role to play, especially when it comes to more local considerations or even considerations of safety, health, poverty, education, even religion, right? Religious questions. A lot of these kinds of questions should be handled primarily on the state and local level. So I think that's where they would have been, then. I don't know that I can say entirely. I mean, circumstances have changed so much, in the last 2 years, what they would exactly think about what's going on now. But I think they would point us to the Constitution and say, read that very carefully and consider two things. First of all, if there's not an explicit power for the government to do those sorts of things, is there an implied power? And if there's an implied power, think about, okay, if you want to say that there's an implied power to do this, ask yourself, well, if that's there, what other implied powers are there? Now I'm thinking more like I'm thinking more like Brutus, I know. Because once you say, well, there are other things that the government should be doing, even though it doesn't say explicitly they can do it, once you open that door, then you have to ask, well, what else can they do, right? So I think they would have some concerns about that. And I think they would also be wary, though. Well, I don't know if I want to go down this. Well, I'll just say, I think Madison, even though he introduced the amendment that became the Bill of Rights, Madison also thought that questions of amending the Constitution should be sort of far and reserved for really great and momentous things, because again, once you open up the Constitution for amending, you might say, well, we need an amendment to fix this, but then people try to slip other things in. I mean, how many times have we seen Congress pass a bill, and then, once they open it up for debate, 49 other things get tacked on, right? So it's the same thing when it comes to amending the Constitution. So proceed with caution would be I think the warning of the advice of the founders on this.
Well, thank you. And we have about 3 minutes left. Janine, is there anything else that you'd like to?
Well, I do have 3 thoughts, actually. Imagine that. Noah and Jonah and Tova is all sort of along the lines. Okay, let's see if I can remember the 3 things. I'm having one of those, days where I'm fatigued. So the first one is, I think Madison, we're talking about what would they think about it today. I think Madison would be very disappointed in the voluminosity, is that a word, of our bills, because he says that in Federal 62, if the laws are so voluminous that they cannot be read or so incoherent that they can't be understood, it's essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, and why have a government? Why elect people of your own choice if you can't understand anything they're doing? So I think Madison would be really, really upset by that. I think there was I had a second thought of who else would be. I think also what Kathy brought up, which is another big pet peeve of mine, but I think that the Anti-Federalists will be very disappointed in this treaty situation, because treaties today are just thrown out there. They're abused. They're called executive orders or executive agreements, surreptitiously, where they don't even have to be approved by the Senate. Or there's so many, once again, the voluminosity, I just made that word up perhaps, but of treaties that they don't even really ratify anymore. So I think that has become, I think he was correct in his concern about the treaties, commercial or not, that they've been the executive branch was given way too much power over treaties, because and in the Senate, I know this is Professor Gordon Lloyd's trigger, but the Senate does not do their job in insisting to ratify these treaties. So I think those are really two examples where our government's got become completely out of control. And I had a third, but what was this last thing we were just talking about? What was this discussion y'all were having the very last?
Put on amending and federal regulation.
Oh, amending. Yes, I think amending. I will disagree with you a little bit in the respect that no one has the patience to amend anymore. Instead, they do all these laws and then they do these executive orders. And I think you're probably referring to a convention of states, which everyone freaks out about because they think it'll be a new, exactly what you're talking about. Change this, change that, change that. And yet our last amendment was 1980 or 90, ratified in the 80s or 90s, and 27. And there's so many things that need to be amended, and then the Congress would have to abide by it instead of laws that are like overturn and change. And I don't know. I worry about whether there's ever going to be enough patience in the American mind that with social media and even in film industry, my industry, they don't even hold the camera on across anybody's face anymore to have a thought. It's like next. And then it seems used to be a minute or two, and now they're 15 seconds. So we've lost our attention span and our frontal lobes. And I don't know that anybody's going to have the patience to actually walk through the process of amending the Constitution. And I think it'd be really important to occasionally have a balanced budget amendment or, whatever you want. But I'm afraid people have given up on that, and we shouldn't. And those are my closing thoughts. And what are your thoughts about that? Closing thoughts to my closing thoughts and everybody else's closing thoughts. But I thought this was a great show. You just did a terrific job, Professor. And I loved having Jonah and Wyatt here, and Tova's always amazing, and Kathy and Aubrey. But Professor, thank you. I think you've been awesome. Would you like to kind of close us out on those three little Janine observations?
I think all three of your points were great points. The last one especially is really important. So on the one hand, when it comes to amending the Constitution, there's a danger of just sort of getting carried away with the latest thing, and we just want to do it and we don't think it through. But your point is a really important one. I would much rather see, and I think that Madison and Hamilton and Washington and others would want to see if there are things that need to change. It should be done by the people, by what Madison called in the Federalist Papers the reasoned will of the American people. And I think you're absolutely right. So much is done by sort of sleight of hand, and we find gimmicky ways to get around things. You mentioned executive orders and executive this and that, and nobody's really taking the time to do their jobs. There's an effort to sort of get around the electoral college system without having to have an amendment. I'm sure you're aware of this, right? So if things need to change, there's a reason why that process is there, and I would much rather have it be done that way. I'm speaking, I think from the perspective of the founders, than for it to be done in some, I don't want to say sneaky, but some, in some way that allows us to get around.
Surreptitiously.
Yeah, surreptitiously. Perfect. Yeah. And the other thing, by the way, so the president, can do these executive orders and executive agreements, none of which, are ratified or agreed to by Congress or the Senate. The other thing that we could mention here is that there are a lot of laws that we all have to follow in this country today that aren't really laws. Laws are passed by Congress, but we follow a lot of regulations that are created by government agencies that don't get the approval of Congress either. I think that's another area where everybody, Federalists and Anti-Federalists at the time, would really be concerned, because what that means is you've taken government out of the hands of the people. You've removed what they call self-government. The more you do these things, and you allow, people to just sort of do things for the sake of expediency. I'll stop there.
Yeah. And it's taken it away from the states as well.
Yeah.
They've lost. I would think they would be shocked at the lack of the power of the states, and I think they would really go, the 17th Amendment. What was that?
Yeah.
Why did you take the power away from the states? To me, that's the biggest change of the United States Constitution structurally, was the 17th Amendment. And as my father said in closing, I'll quote beloved father, Turner Marie Scant Jr. I was 8 years old and I looked up to him. I don't know why, but I guess I always had a founding father, guardian angel. And I said, Dad, if our founding fathers were to come back today, what would they be most disappointed about? Who asked that in the 1960s or 70s? But my dad thought about it for a minute. I never forgot this moment. He looked down at me and said, taxes. So that would be the 16th Amendment. Is it the 16th Amendment? All right. I'm very chatty for having such a vague day. But thank you, Professor. You're awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks for the great questions.
Really a treat. I hope you'll come back. But real
Would love
treat.
to.
Okay.
Would love to.
And Jonah and Wyatt. So thank you for your wonderful American citizenry and Jonah going to serve the country in the Army. Did I hear that correctly? Yeah. So good for you. And Wyatt can't wait to see what you do as well. And Tova, I guess, had run. And Aubrey's going to go coach an Olympic team. I just know it. She's going to be out there during the Olympics, coaching an Olympic, whatever she chooses, volleyball maybe or soccer. All right, Kathy, we just, this wouldn't even be happening without Kathy. So everybody want to say see ya? Say goodnight, John Boy.
I just want to invite everybody to come back next week, Tuesday at 2 Eastern, where we're going to be talking about the role of the first branch, the role of Congress specifically. And our Anti-Federalist paper is Brutus III. Our Federalist paper is Federalist 55, and you can find them on our website when you click Learn More for that episode. So please sign up now. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Jonah, Wyatt, want to say see you later, alligator? Can they hear me? Jonah, Wyatt, can y'all hear me? Are they frozen? They're gone. Okay. Aubrey, you can say night, John Boy.
Night, John Boy.
No one even knows what I'm talking about. It was called The Waltons back in the 70s, I think. It was a TV show. And at the end of the TV show, everyone was saying, night, John. Good night, John Boy. Good night, John Boy.
I grew up watching that show.
You knew that, right, Professor?
I did, yeah.
Okay. All right. Good night, everybody, or good day.
Right.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.